Hello, my name is Bill Peschel, and this is Mechanicsburg Mystery Presents, a conversation with Cordelia Frances Biddle. Cordelia Frances Biddle is an independent historian and an author with a passion for history, particularly involving the Philadelphia area. She has written numerous magazine articles, a one-man show about St. Peter's Church in Philadelphia, and an interpretive tour for the Ebenezer Maxwell Museum. She wrote a biography of Catherine Drexel, the heiress who became a Catholic nun and used her inheritance to help African Americans and Native Americans, and was canonized as a saint. And since this is a podcast sponsored by a mystery bookstore, we have to mention her crossword mystery series, 12 novels she co-wrote with her husband, Steve Zettler, under the pen name Nero Blanc. And she has also published 5 novels in the Martha Beale mystery series that is set in the Gilded Age of Philadelphia. But we are here today to talk about her nonfiction book, Biddle, Jackson, and a Nation in Turmoil, the Infamous Bank War, that was released in February from Sunbury Press. So please welcome to the show, Cordelia Frances Biddle. Thank you for coming here today.
Thank you so much, Bill. I'm delighted to actually not be with you, but be with you visually, I guess. It's
Absolutely
wonderful. Thank you for inviting me.
You're very welcome. Now, I understand that you have a relationship. You're related to Nicholas Biddle, the subject of your book.
I am. He's my great, I don't know how many great grandfather. So direct descendant. And like all of us in the family, I grew up hearing about him. He was kind of a mythical figure. He was the great financier. I went to his country estate, Andalusia, when I was a child and was in awe of it. It never occurred to me, though, that I was going to write about him. And I became fascinated first in the era because I knew nothing about it. And the same was true with my Martha Beale books, which take place in 1842, early 40s. I knew nothing about it. And I knew about Jackson, but it was hazy in my mind. And I thought, let me go back and look at this man and his place in history, which is what I started to do. And I went to Andalusia to do my primary research, some of my primary research, and found, lo and behold, that another descendant had just given Andalusia, Biddle's estate, a gift of Biddle's original correspondence with James Monroe. And they had been hidden in an attic in this descendant's house. No one had ever seen them before. And the archivist was busy trying to find archival sleeves and catalog them and so forth. And I was agog. They were so different than what I found eventually in the finished letters in the Library of Congress. And Biddle had excised words and phrases which made them almost impossible to understand, because it was pursuant to our previous correspondence. I agree, but what on earth is that? But the draft correspondence has all of the information that Biddle felt was too dangerous to put in the mail. And I thought, what is going on here? I was so intrigued. And so that, it was like my little personal murder, not a murder mystery, but a mystery.
Well, it certainly gives you an idea of what was going on in his head and what he wanted to convey, as opposed to what was actually in the letters themselves, which could be intercepted and copied and all that. So he had to be very careful about what he was saying in print that could be dangerous.
Absolutely. And he was, Monroe had asked him, I'm probably getting ahead of myself, but Monroe had asked him to, I'll step back for a split second. When he was a young man, he went to Europe in 1804 to 1807. He graduated from Princeton University 1800 at the age of 15, wasn't called Princeton University then, but it became Princeton University. He was the youngest man to this day to do so. And he ended up working as a private secretary for the minister to France, and then to the minister to England, who was Monroe. And that was where his friendship with Monroe sprang. And so eventually, when Monroe was looking, as president, was looking for help with creating the second bank of the United States, and that bank had so many problems in its inception. There was graft and greed and insider trading. He turned to Nicholas Biddle because he knew he could trust him, and said, I'm going to put you on the board here. Could you report back? So a lot of those letters dealt with, don't believe this person, believe that person. But as I said, it was excised. So then he simply journeyed down to Washington and said, this is what I discovered, because he couldn't trust that information in the mail. And of course, there was no Acela. This was a 3-day jaunt in a stagecoach.
Oh, yes. Well, let's pull back even a little bit more further, because what was important about having, because this is the second national bank of the United States, and we're used to seeing banks on every corner and very modern system of banking. But back then, the notion of a national bank, and this is similar to, and Nicholas Biddle had known this is similar to the Bank of England, or whatever the French equivalent is. This is a bank in which basically it's the repository of the government's money. And that in colonial times, financing the government was very important, right?
Absolutely. Well, this was the first bank of the United States, as we know, was the creation of Alexander Hamilton. And I don't think there's going to be a rap musical about Nicholas Biddle, but if anybody's listening and wishes to do so, I'm happy to advise. But Biddle thought that was an incredible institution, and that institution came under attack. There was people who didn't want a national bank, who felt that there again, it's states' rights. People felt that there should be the Bank of Virginia or the Bank of Massachusetts, but there shouldn't be a national bank. And so Alexander Hamilton's bank came under attack in 1810, and Biddle defended it as a young neophyte legislator and said, we must have a national bank. How will monies move from one place to another? If there's a war, how are you going to pay your troops? You can't do it with gold. So he argued this, and yet the Pennsylvania legislature said, we are not going to continue with this bank. And that happened throughout the nation at that point. And then, of course, there was the War of 1812, and we almost went bankrupt because there was no national bank. And so the second Bank of the United States wasn't chartered until 1816.
And was it that in response to the conditions, the
Yes.
economic conditions as a result? So it's like
Yes.
they chartered one bank, and that was enough to grow the country, to lend confidence in the currency, because all the states operated their own banks for good or otherwise. And having a national
Yes.
bank lent more confidence that allowed the country to develop its resources and grow at the end of its natural life term, because these banks were chartered for like 20 years, weren't they?
Yes, that's correct.
And they had to be renewed. So it didn't get renewed. The war came, they learned their lesson, they started another bank. And 20 years later, during Andrew Jackson's presidency, you want to take it from there? It's like we didn't learn the lesson the first time.
But it was still this polarizing issue of states' rights, of people in the South not trusting people in the North. It was the Whigs in the North versus the Democrats in the South. And there was this deep divide. And the bank, Andrew Jackson's stalwart supporters used the bank as a means of really attacking the other political side. And it became so vitriolic and vicious. I mean, there was a cartoon of Biddle being pilloried in a political cartoon in a newspaper of Biddle being pilloried on one side and Andrew Jackson being roasted on a spit on the other. The politics were so frightening. And I did my research at the Library of Company in Philadelphia, where I was able to read the real newspapers, not on microfiche, but the real copies of the newspapers. And paging through them, I spent months happily ensconced in other eras. But they would bring you the real newspaper bound together. So you ask for a month and you page through them. And to look at these images, I thought, what happened to our nation? Why did we grow to hate one another so much? And it was also very interesting to me that Biddle considered himself a populist. He thought that banking and infrastructure, which he was also very interested in and creating canals and railroads, that banking at distances brought people together. So if I'm in Massachusetts or Rhode Island, I know then how people in, let's say, Georgia are borrowing money and why they're borrowing money and what they need. And that the people in South Carolina then have the same sense of understanding of the people in Massachusetts. But somehow during Jackson's time, that really was used against not only the bank, but the opposing political party.
Mm-hmm. Now, your book is of course about the bank war, but it's also really about Biddle, and you cover his life from the beginning. You even go back to his antecedents, including Nicholas Biddle, his uncle, I believe, who was the captain, which I have read a lot of naval history, and I could cringe at the thought of him going up. There was a ship-to-ship battle in which he had 32 guns, and he went up against a ship of the line with 64 guns. And I admit, it was a brave captain, and unfortunately the numbers prevailed and his ship blew up with only 4 survivors. But I was astonished at the action you described in the book.
Well, that was fascinating to me to read that, and I found a wonderful account written by James Fenimore Cooper. And James Fenimore Cooper had by then become a famous novelist. And my guess is that his publisher must have said, you know, Mr. Cooper, you're so successful, and if you turn your mind to something else, I'll bet you sell just as well. So he created this vast tome of the entire history of the United States Navy up until that time. Mm-hmm. And he was meticulous in describing the exact locations and the headings and so forth, and the sea and how the sea was churning and swelling. And so that account of that battle is, you feel that you're right there. Of course, he's a wonderful writer. Yeah. To me, he's still alive.
He's still a good writer. He is.
Yes, that's right. That's true.
Well, it explains why there's, I'm looking in further into Nicholas's legacy, that there were 4 ships in the U.S. Navy named for him in the 20th century, including one as recently as 93. And I think that's a wonderful way to honor his memory and his courage. And, you know, it was, he played a very high-risk game, and if he had won, he would have secured a lot of cannons and ammunition for the colonial cause during the Revolutionary War. It would have been a great victory.
Absolutely, and we needed all that ammunition, and we needed that heavy artillery. We were in desperate.
Yeah, but it also explains why Nicholas Biddle, the subject of the book, he saw himself as an aristocrat. He saw himself as a member of one of the founding families of the country. You know, his ancestors were involved in the Revolutionary War, and he got to become also involved with President Jefferson in the editing of the Lewis and Clark papers, which was a major undertaking.
It was, and that was so interesting to me. I could almost have written a full book about how that came about, because Clark wrote to him in 1810 and said, you have been recommended as an editor for these journals. And I'm not sure whether that was Jefferson. There's just no hint about how that happened. But after Biddle came back from Europe in 1807, he went immediately to meet with Thomas Jefferson to describe what was happening in Europe at the time, because, as you know, that was the height of the Napoleonic Wars. And he had traveled extensively through Europe and had information that nobody else had at that time. And so when this came about that, that William Clark wrote to him, Biddle's first response was, I have no idea. That's an enormous undertaking. That's going to take years. So, and being a rash young person, he said no, and then changed his mind the next day. And he never really lost that sense of, I'm going to do it. No, I'm not. Yes, I am. Absolutely. Full bore. So he then wrote back to Clark and said, I've changed my mind. But lest that letter not arrive soon enough, he jumped on a stagecoach and journeyed for 4 days down to see Clark in Virginia, and actually was there before the letter was even received. So then their correspondence back and forth it's just a delight to read, because Clark is reliving these extraordinary adventures. And Nicholas Biddle writes to him and says, now I see you here, and now I'm with you there, and tell me more, and give me the names of all of those trees and those plants and those people, and give me the translations of those tribal languages. You were there with both men.
Yeah.
I loved reading those letters.
Well, and his response in the editing of the journal, which was 1 million words, we're talking, you mentioned that, and I'm flabbergasted at how much that is, because I'm editing my wife's novel and it's only 220,000 words.
Yeah.
Thought of 5 times that is really daunting. But he brought out a lot of information that Clark didn't put in there. And his editing job went kind of beyond just making sure the grammar is correct and transcribing everything. He helped refine the book to make it more useful.
Well, he had been, he loved literature, and he had been the editor of the Portfolio, which was then the preeminent literary compendium of the time.
Yeah.
And the writers who contributed to that were extraordinary, and Adams being one of them. So he had this enormous reverence for words, and for how powerful words are, and how you convey emotion and thought. And so I think he was a natural to do this job, but he didn't feel that he was until he began doing it. And then he was swept away.
Mm-hmm. So what we have here is a young man of 15 to graduate from Princeton. So he's obviously intellectually fluent. Not a good use of words, I'm afraid, but he's learned to edit books. He went on his journey to Europe, for which you found the journals that had thought to be lost. And you have suspicions that he ended up kind of being a foreign correspondent to Jefferson. And was it Monroe as well?
Monroe, yeah, he was, I believe, I can't use the word spy in the book, but I believe that's the purpose that he served, because the European journals are really interesting. Mm-hmm. They are, the ones that are in Europe tend to only talk about dinner companions, famous dinner companions, famous artwork, places that he travels. He never mentions the Napoleonic Wars, and yet he journeys from France into occupied Austria, which means crossing through Switzerland and seeing all of the troop migrations. And he doesn't mention the, quote, noisy cannonades of Europe until he gets to Greece, and there writes again another journal that takes place in Greece. And so how is that possible? Is did he fear that if the journals were taken from him while he was crossing from one border to another, that someone white might understand what his true mission was? I don't know, but there's no reference to any of the war, and it was consuming Europe. So it just made me wonder. And then I also found at Andalusia a cipher. So this was a popular form of sending a letter in code. I can't translate it, so I don't know what it means, but I found it to be really a compelling argument for the fact that he was doing something clandestine for the nation. And then the fact that he went immediately to visit with or meet with President Jefferson when he came home in 1807, although his parents believed that he was coming directly back to Philadelphia, and went to meet him at the Lazaretto where he was to be, his ship was going to be maintained until he could be free to come into Philadelphia.
Well, and in a previous interview, you'd mentioned that you employ informed conjecture from reading this. And I think your interpretation is correct, because there's no other reason to have a cipher in your papers if you don't intend to use it, or if you have no interest otherwise in the rudiments of spy. And it doesn't necessarily have to be spycraft. It can simply be you're acting as a back channel courier. You know, you're talking to people, they want to say, if you're talking to the President Jefferson, just mention this. And of course, it's always a matter of just gathering information. What's the gossip? What's the news? What did you see? And it's not necessarily espionage in the way it's commonly considered. It's just simply you're acting as the eyes of somebody else.
Absolutely. And he did that when he went to Malta, because he met with a then commandant, American commandant in Malta, and who gave him all sorts of information about the British presence in Malta and how they were hoping to maintain their strength against Napoleon. And there again, that came into that Greek journal, but it couldn't come into any of the journals from Europe.
Mm-hmm. Well, this becomes important because when he was appointed as a director of the Second National Bank. The bank was in kind of a sad state, wasn't it?
It was the original directors. The man who was the president was a poor choice. And he surrounded himself with directors. He was a fairly weak individual, and he surrounded himself with directors who were on the take. And there was graft and greed was rampant. They were doing insider trading. And so Monroe, who was then president, said, I need a director. I need someone to go in and examine this. And would you serve as a director and report back to me only? Yeah. And Biddle did that, and was able to make recommendations for how the entire bank should be changed, and how he wrote a whole portfolio on that. And how banking, they should get rid of this director and that director, but create transparency, because there was none.
That's what's so fascinating, I find, about Biddle, is his ability to master that arcane subject for which he had no experience before. Is that correct?
None. He really, when he was at Princeton, he couldn't even balance his finances. He was constantly asking his father for money and saying, oh, I don't know what became of the money you sent me last month, but I don't know. So the idea that he would even consider going into banking, but he was also, he loved literature, but he was a very methodical person and thoughtful person. So he was kind of a polymath in many ways. His brain was linear and nonlinear at the same time. I don't know how that's possible. My brain is only linear, nonlinear. I don't know.
I find it very difficult as well. That's why I have notebooks and schedules and workflows. It's the only thing, because otherwise the brain just shoots off ideas in all sorts of different directions. But also, I guess, because he's acting as Monroe's informant, And he's also helping to restructure and reform the banking system, the second national bank. And of course, there's opposition to that as well from the people who are profiting from it.
Absolutely, but he prevailed. And so the bank became a very stable and trusted institution. The Rothschilds, as you mentioned, the French banking system admired him. The British admired him. They admired how he transformed this organization and made it really a national, strong, trusted institution. And I often wonder whether if it had not been for Jackson's absolute distrust of banking altogether, because Jackson had been bankrupted himself at one point, and he really distrusted the institution of banking. He distrusted the people whom he viewed as the moneyed elite. And I often think if Biddle had continued to prevail, and the second bank of the United States, which was based in Philadelphia, had continued its success story, Wall Street, as we know it, wouldn't have existed. That would still be Philadelphia, but it was Martin Van Buren, who was a New Yorker and who was Jackson's vice president, who was whispering in his ear and saying, I think we should move this institution to New York.
Mm-hmm.
So you wonder how different our nation would have been. Of course, I say that as a Philadelphian. I would have liked to have seen that here.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think what I really enjoyed about the book is that it's a biography. It deals with economics. It deals with early American history, and it brings it all together to kind of show how personalities can influence history. You get the right person in the right time. You may have a Lincoln. You get the wrong person in the times, and you have a Jackson and Van Buren. Because as you point out afterwards, after the bank was closed, they went through a panic and a depression for a number of years.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And there's a wonderful journalist in Philadelphia who wrote about how tragic everything had become, and all the fine houses were put up for sale. Nobody had any money. Everybody was depressed. There was just nothing to be had. And those were the wealthy people. So the people who were not wealthy, who were struggling, really were in absolute despair because of this.
Yeah. And it shows the importance of how you have to have structures, you have to have laws, you have to have oversight, and you have to have transparency in order to build a system that is trustworthy.
Yes.
Because like any institution, anything that goes on long enough can have people who come in with not altruistic purposes in mind. And that is one thing Biddle had. He saw this as a duty. That was part of his aristocratic privilege, wasn't it?
He did. He felt that, well, this family had come here in 1681 and as Quakers and settled in New Jersey. And he felt that this was an inherited duty to nation, and to do whatever he could to protect and strengthen this nation that he loved and that his family had loved for generations.
Yes, that noblesse oblige. As you put it in there, he was influenced by their father, Charles. And
Yes.
You're right, his sons understood that they were nobler men and more productive citizens because of their father's high expectations of them. His daughters, that they should be the helpmeets of respected and industrious husbands.
Yes.
And
yes,
a very thoughtful statement. I had to pause for a little bit to think about that.
It's interesting because now we don't think of that. We think of women having their own power and their own rights, but that was not true at the time. And so I had to keep subjugating my own sense of who I am and saying, no, that's what these women were, helpmeets. And if they were good at their job, as all of the Biddle women seem to be, then they furthered their husbands' careers because they were constantly saying, "Oh, but have you considered this?" I think Jane Biddle did that with Nicholas Biddle, Jane being the wife of Nicholas, but very quiet in the background.
Yes. My wife, who was in the Navy, said something along the lines of, it's something like you get to be a 1-star rank through your own efforts, but you get to be a flag rank through your wife's efforts. So some things don't change, but it's really, that is important about reminding about women's roles at the time, but it's still that we miss that sense of service and noblesse oblige, which can be anybody who's doing a job that involves some authority, to be able to make decisions that are not always self-serving.
Absolutely. Well, I think Biddle felt that. I mean, he grew up with his father having been in the Revolutionary War, his uncle, another uncle who served on the state legislature. And so it was a given that you served your country in whatever capacity you were called.
Yeah.
It was just a given.
Now, what I also liked about your book, particularly about depicting Biddles, that you depict whatever his shortcomings as well. His inability to handle his personal finances, but also his belief that he knew best, and if he just explained to somebody, they would agree with him. I must say, I loved finding his hubris, because what I didn't want to do was paint him as perfect and Jackson as imperfect. I really wanted to find the places where his flaws came in, because any good writing, you want to create a character who has difficulties. And I think he probably understood those difficulties, but was powerless to stop himself from saying, this worthy president, and I'm going to defeat him, and blowing off steam constantly. But he was also powerless. He thought he could defeat a sitting president. That's impossible. But it didn't stop him from trying. And I found his hubris, instead of irritating, I found it, I don't want to say charming, because that's not really quite the right word, but I found it very helpful for me as an author to say, here's a weakness in this man. And how do I write about that weakness? We all have them. And do I myself, am I filled with so much pride that I would think I could defeat a sitting president? Maybe. Oh yes, yes, our reach exceeds our grasp.
Yes.
So how long have you been working on this book?
Oh gosh, I think the research, writing, 4.5 years.
Mm-hmm. I could see that. Just deciphering his handwriting must have taken him 2 or 3 years alone.
I was very lucky with that, because when I was up at Andalusia reading his letters, the wonderful archivist there, Connie Houchins, I was taking his letters and turning them upside down so that I could try to read them. And she peered over my shoulder and she said, "I think that's an A." And I had no idea. It was so interesting when he was writing and happy, his handwriting sloped up. When he was worried about something, the handwriting sloped down. It was fascinating, because I felt then that I was with him as he was composing these letters.
Yeah. I can see, and it is a fascinating read. And I highly recommend it if you're at all interested in this period. And if you're especially looking at presidential politics and the way the media plays a role, there is just some fascinating parallels to current history there. No matter what you think, history repeats itself, and sometimes it does rhyme very accurately. And I highly recommend your book.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, you've also written a number of mystery series. You've written the Nero Blanc series, but I wanted to ask about your Martha Beale series. Can you describe for us what you were doing with it? It's up to 5 books now, isn't it?
Yep. And I started that because I really knew nothing about Philadelphia between the wars.
Mhm.
That being the War of 1812 and the Civil War. I live in the past. I mean, I just live in the past. So, except for Zoom. And I wanted to understand it. And then I found that this era, this particular era, the 1840s, was a time of such chasm between wealth and poverty. And I wanted to expose that. I wanted to expose how women were treated. And I didn't want to stand on a soapbox. I think that's pretty boring. So I created a female protagonist, Martha Beale, and she is the daughter of a financier. I didn't think of Nicholas Biddle.
This was before this.
I don't know what I was channeling, but so she's the daughter of a wealthy man. He goes missing in the first book, and she then takes it upon herself to try to find out what happened to him. And it leads her into a netherworld of Philadelphia misery and poverty. And she then sets about trying to rectify that, as well as trying to understand what happened to her father. And so I wrote it as just a standalone book, but I became so fascinated by the period and so fascinated by her as she developed, because in the first book, she starts out rather trepidating and then comes into her own. And there's a love interest, of course. But she really becomes a very strong woman, even though she, on the surface, is not permitted to be so. Now, her wealth does set her apart. If she were a person of no means, she wouldn't be permitted to do that, to behave that way. She becomes an iconoclast. And I just had a wonderful time writing about her and her adventures. And there were people who wandered into the book. There was a little boy who all of a sudden just appeared, and he was supposed to be an ancillary character, just watching something happen on a hillside. And all of a sudden he was part of another novel. And then an actress whom I fashioned after a real actress who had been British, who came to this country and married a man who was living in Philadelphia but owned slaves. And so I put her in the novel, and it just kind of grew exponentially. And I find the period just fascinating.
Yeah. Would Philadelphians recognize certain locations in those books?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I believe that my research must be exact. If I say something happens on a certain day, I want the reader to know that that happened on that day in that place. And the building looked exactly the same. Because I walk down the street and I can look at all the houses that surround me in the middle of what is now called Society Hill in Philadelphia. Mm-hmm. And I can conjure up all of these scenes. Yeah. Well, that was the first novel, was called The Conjurer, but I used that language because I think those people are real to me.
Yeah. Yeah. And I remember I took my son down to Constitutional Hall on a field trip for us. And we literally walked around the corner and found a restaurant. There's a restaurant there that is from a building that existed in colonial times. And you walk down that street and you can kind of half close your eyes and still see what it must have been like, because a lot of the neighborhood seems to be very well preserved from colonial days.
It is, absolutely. When I'm walking back home from either the library company or the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, I am so wrapped up in history that I'm a danger to myself, because I expect to hear horses and carriages and people selling fruits and vegetables on the street corners. And when a SEPTA bus pulls back past me, I think, what on earth happened here? How did I time travel? Mm-hmm. Because, in fact, I've time traveled in the other direction.
Yes, it's like stepping out of a Jack Finney novel time and again, which is
wonderful.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for talking to us about this. I had a great time, and it has flown really quick here. So if people want to know more about you and your books, where can they reach you?
My website is cordeliafrancisbiddle.net, and that's FRANCES. So cordeliafrancisbiddle.net. And I'm delighted to answer emails, or my email address is on there as well. So if people want to get in touch with me, they can. If they want to shoot me a line, I'm delighted to respond.
Absolutely. Are you working on anything else now, by the way?
I am. I have one novel that will be coming out in November 2022. Very dark, but I'm working on, and that's also history. But I'm working on a book that I just love right now, which is taking a house in Philadelphia and telling the entire history of the city from the British occupation, from the house's point of view. So the house is a character.
Oh, that sounds wonderful.
I am overjoyed with it. I am, just because then if something happens, the house says, oh, I know the truth there. You don't.
Yep. Oh, that sounds wonderful. I'm getting a little tingles that says, oh, that's a good idea. I wish I could steal it.
You can borrow it. You can have a different house at a different location.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I got plenty of jobs right now. So that's one of those things that goes in the idea file, and then I can forget about it until some other time. So,
good.
So people, if you're interested in Biddle, Jackson, and A Nation in Turmoil, it's available through Sunbury Press. And of course, it's available at Mechanicsburg Mystery Bookshop. Cordelia Francis Biddle, that evocative name. Thank you so much for talking with us today.
Thank you, Bill. I had a wonderful time.
And this is Bill Peschel for Mechanicsburg Mystery Presents, and I hope your favorite book is the next one you read. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The Mechanicsburg Mystery Presents podcast is sponsored by the Mechanicsburg Mystery Bookshop in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. The store is open with limited hours, plus we accept appointments and offer a drive-by service. The store will also ship books to your home, including those from the Peschel Press Mystery line, including our annotated editions of novels by Agatha Christie and Dorothy L. Sayers. To learn more, visit the store at www.mysterybooksonline.com. And thank you for listening.